Hi, everyone. We are in week 7 of our term, and we'll have 2 more weeks. I've been in contact with the Mormon missionaries. So on Wednesday, when we have our chat, I'll kind of talk through how that's going to work. But for now, we are in the book 9 Lives about India and various religious expressions in India. Let me start by saying that I really appreciated your reflections on Mary Douglas. Um, I was heartened, felt like everyone was reading and paying attention to what the text was saying. And that's an important thing in this kind of online environment. It seemed like a number of you enjoyed that text. I gave full credit on the Friday assignment to people who were, if you could see that there's kind of, she has an argument about society and individual religious expression. So, for example, the idea of baraka or luck, she's arguing that um, societies that are more informal and where it's unclear where centers of power lie will be drawn to these kind of floating versions of spiritual power. Uh, so if it's very crystal clear that there's an authority structure and that you gain success in society by following that authority structure, then you won't have these informal patterns. But if it's very unclear and vague how exactly you achieve success in society, then that society will come to an emphasis on concepts like luck or baraka, blessing. And that's a much more kind of diffused version of how to get success or blessing or what have you. Something similar when it comes to food, that there's a relationship between social situation and the way we intake food into our bodies. So if you're a member of a group which is hard pressed and threatened in some way, or that feels like it can't maintain its identity, then there will be an emphasis on limiting or regulating the food that comes into the body. So these are interesting ideas that I think make us reflect on the idea that religious structures and values aren't just kind of out there and big ideas, but they influence the way we understand our bodies, the way we take things in from the outside into our bodies, our food, um, uh, and then also how we understand very informal things like luck or blessing. And so I hope that that is a text that will leave you thinking about the broadness of religious studies and how to understand religious structures. All right. Um, Now we're turning and looking at this book, 9 Lives, which is largely about I think the author is fairly masterful in the way that he works to capture these lives on their own terms, right? He's interviewing people. He's trying to present a little bit about the background of these traditions that they're part of, but always kind of centering on a person and what they feel and understand about their own life. Um, and it begins with, I think, there's a couple chapters in here that are really stand up, but this Jain chapter I find is fantastic for what it says about um, just a tradition that a lot of people haven't heard of. I was looking through what you all have written so far and how you've responded. Where's the positive here? You know, we have a woman who is um, who's committed herself to Selikana, which is basically her own slow death. They don't call it suicide because it's not despair, but it's a forward movement out of this life, which means her death. And so it can be an interesting place, and we'll talk about this on Wednesday, of how do we see this? How do we understand these kind of extreme religious expressions, such as a woman of 38 years old leaving this life as a result of her beliefs? Where's the positive in that? So I was looking, and students are often kind of divided on this question. And in your responses, I see that same thing. So some of you, I'll just point out some of you by name. Gabe, um, you thought that these are religious expressions that could ultimately give hope. A number of you came down on that word. Michael, you also thought that were struck by the way these traditions give hope. Amelia really liked the way you put it about transcendence, that, you know, irrespective of maybe some of the, the early death of this woman, for example, religions provided a sense of the transcendent or something that's over and above life. And then there were a couple of you who really had problems with this idea of Salikana. Tim, um, uh, you were concerned about the idea that this woman was dying at age 38. That certainly didn't have to happen. And Ryan were uh, somewhat horrified at some of what it would mean to be a Jain monk, pulling hair out by the roots and things like that. Right? It's an extreme religious tradition. You're absolutely correct. And what we have to wonder is, does she and does her broader society gain from this, or is this just an example of how maybe we need to, as human beings, kind of get rid of some of these more extreme versions of religious expression? And then I really enjoyed, Ben, you have kind of a nature theme that you've been developing in responses and so on. And I liked what uh, you picked up on some of the um, interesting uh, ramifications of Jain belief on how we treat the natural world. And in fact, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the Jains right now. So I'm going to switch over to a slide share um, uh, lecture just to talk through a little bit more about the Jains, and then I'll come back here and talk about our discussion on Wednesday. Okay. I want to talk about the Jains just to give a little bit of background to what this group is. They can be found throughout India, and it used to be that we had an ACM study abroad site at Pune, not too far from Mumbai, um, kind of on the western coast of India. And students would have a homestay, and there was one homestay that I was able to visit just to see kind of what these homestays were like, so I could help recruit students back here at Lawrence. And by the way, India is a great place to do study abroad. Religious Studies has short-term trips. We did this last December to India, and there are also term-long or semester-long trips you can do. And it's a fantastic place to see a very different culture and to learn a lot about different religious traditions. And believe it or not, it will happen in the next few years that you can do study abroad again. So don't despair, though, even though we're kind of in this distant learning mode right now. So this is the homestay that I visited, and it was a Jain family. So I think that's, first of all, the thing to realize is that there's lots of lay people who are Jains, and they're not at all practicing the extreme devotion that you see in the monks and the nuns, right? They are living in nice middle-class houses and thriving in many ways. Now, when I walked in, I was fascinated to see, I hadn't at first realized they were Jain, and then I was looking around and I started recognizing the signs that this was a Jain family. So how would I do that? And I asked them, I started talking about Jainism, and asked if I could take a picture of a couple things like this cupboard that they have. So you'll see at the bottom, you'll see Ganesh, right? And Ganesh is a Hindu god, very popular in Pune for success. And you might be surprised to see kind of a Hindu god kind of worked into the family's home, but that's very common. In some ways, this is like having a Packer sign or something like that. It's a regional symbol, and it is religious, but Jains have no trouble kind of being part of that broader religious world of India and different regions of India. But if you look above the elephant god, sitting elephant god, that's Ganesh. If you look above it, you'll see these Tirthankaras, one sitting and then one standing up on the next level. And these are the Jain, they're not deities, but they're people, individuals who have kind of gone ahead. They're forward makers. They've crossed over from this world and they're in this higher world that we'll talk about in a moment. Here's a better example. This is one of the very early ones, and there's a number of Tirthankaras, and they go back thousands of years, and many of these are mythical mythical beings. There's no historical record of them. Now, elsewhere around Pune, there's a Jain temple. And I found out about where this was out on the outskirts. And so I went there to visit. And here I am kind of in traffic, but looking up at the Jain temple. And there's kind of a series of structures that are part of this temple. In fact, if you look behind me, when I go back to the main screen, you'll see one of those temples that are part of this kind of complex of temples. I got into that big temple and walked around, and what you see on the walls are these framed scriptures of the Jain group. So although we're not reading it, we're concentrating on this description of the life of this Jain nun. There's a lot that you can analyze about Jainism that follows what we've been talking about in our class, which is a scripture, right? A place that people can go back, make arguments about. There are stories. It could be analyzed in many of the same ways that we did when we talked about the Ramayana. In fact, the Ramayana itself has a Jain retelling, emphasizing their points about the world and how to be and live in the world, right? That's not what this is, but this is, you see these kind of copper plates, which are some of the Jain scriptures just framed in the temple itself. Here's another view of the kind of internal court of the Jain temple, and you see the scriptures kind of around the inside of the court here. This is still inside the temple, but this is an example of the central Jain pilgrimage place. And so, we've seen the relationship between place and religion, the tendency to build up sacred space. And this is an example for the Jains. So you'll see down at the bottom, you can see people arriving, and you can even see like minibuses and taxis down there. And then you arrive, and then you're there's all these different shrines, many dedicated to these Tirthankaras. There's a number of those, right? People who have crossed over and reached the highest state. And you can kind of go and visit shrine after shrine after shrine in this central pilgrimage spot for the Jain. Now here's another temple that's in this Jain complex. And this is again one of the Tirthankaras. And in our text, you even get a sense of what happens here. When Mataji goes, she bows down. She took some water from the attendant priest, poured it over the hands of the statues. The water she collected in a pot, then used it to anoint the top of her own head. So we get in our text the sense of how these statues would be used. And I think that's a really important, what I like about this text is the way it allows us not just to look at images and pictures like this, but also to kind of imagine how they're used in part of a ritual worship. Now, one thing that's pointed out in the chapter is that these Tirthankaras are present. They're here and they can be worshipped by believers, but they're also not looking out at us, right? They've been liberated from this world. Their backs are more or less turned. So even though their presence can be felt in these locations, they are not actually, they're not paying attention or looking out at our world. You'll notice in this image, you have the men on the left and then the women on the right, and you can see some of the nuns, right, with their covered like they are. And so this is where people would come to express their devotion to this particular Tirthankara. I'm drawn to the images of water and marsh life that's on both sides of the image. And this is where we can perhaps talk about, one of the real distinctives of Jainism is a sense that every living soul, every living creature is a soul on its round of life and death and rebirth and moving forward. And whenever we hurt or harm a living thing in this world, something accrues almost like in a physical way to our karma, to ourself, and that pulls us down. So if we want to rise, we need to walk through the world doing no harm to other souls who are also striving to advance and move forward. And that means I mean, I love ponds and I love the natural world, and it's filled with natural things, right? So there's a way in which you have to avoid stepping in puddles, sweep things ahead of you, you know, take dust and don't throw it away or burn it or something, but put it in a special place so that any microscopic living things won't be harmed. These are really distinctive views of Jainism. And one way to think about that is that whereas Buddhism puts doubt on the concept of the self and selfhood, and that's what you have to escape from, Jainism in some ways doubles down on selfhood, that you are not going to escape from yourself. You as a self are eternal, and you need to rise in these kind of um, stages of life and achieve uh, pulling away from this system, right? So there's a little bit of a emphasis on the self, which is a contrast to Buddhism. Now here's the symbols. So, Jainism, you get a sense of this reading the chapter, pushes us into this system of symbols. And we could go further into this, but this is just kind of what I want you to see. Um, Thinking about the world as a body, that we are kind of here, that we are kind of want to advance up to the top, this abode of the liberated soul. And there's these three dots for right faith, right conduct, right knowledge. These are ways to advance and improve in the afterlife. Then this hand, you may have seen that before, is about ahimsa, or nonviolence. And again, it's an ethical point of view, because of hurting other creatures will hurt your own ability to move forward in the next in your rebirth. Now, one of this concept of souls and the fact that every living thing has a soul is really important and leads to some fascinating ideas, such as this kind of graded sense of what is living. So there is one sensed, trees and plants; two sensed, these are, very, oysters and snails; three sensed insects; four sensed; five sensed, no mind, this may be snakes and reptiles; and then five sensed mammals, human beings, elephants, dogs, what have you. So everything is united by being alive, and everything is ensouled. But our task in living is to kind of work on the lowest end of that scale of life. And that would mean eating plants largely. Now, Jains won't even pick up root plants, like, say, carrots and onions, because in the process of pulling them out of the ground, you may be disturbing and killing life forms. So it's especially things that can be cut and harvested in that way, that they believe we should be eating. But then you can kind of move up, but you want to be kind of low on this list in the things that you eat. You want to be in fact, on the vegetable side, right? As opposed to eating meats at the high end. So part of what has come from this emphasis on souls and not harming other souls is kind of a systematic way of understanding um, how to think about life on this planet. And that's something that fascinates me, right? There are beliefs, and then those are theorized and become kind of theologically expressed in fairly complex ways. All right, now this is going to be kind of the final slide. I just want to say, you can see here the round of life, that we are here in the middle level where humans and animals live. We're in this kind of round of rebirth. We want to move forward and get to the top, where you're in this kind of abode of liberated beings. And this is where the Tirthankara live, these forward makers who crossed over, and we're in their path. And there's these kind of middle ranges of gods and heavenly beings, and then a lower level of hellish beings. Now, there's no transcendent outside God. Remember when we talked about transcendence in Genesis 1, a God who was kind of outside and created the world. Instead, there is nothing outside the system. The system itself is eternal. And through certain mechanisms that are built into that systems, like karma and self and rebirth, we are kind of advancing or going backwards in this grand system. But through right conduct, right thinking, not harming others, ahimsa, we can move forward and eventually get to the top, where we no longer are subject to that kind of constant rebirth and falling backwards. So in a lot of ways, you can think of it, and in fact, our chapter makes reference to it as an atheistic religion, in the sense there is no transcendent outside God who created the system. Even gods or divine beings are part of the system itself. Okay, I'm going to come back. Okay, so but behind me you see this Jain Temple that I was talking about in the in the lecture just now. Okay, so we'll start on Wednesday talking about it. I want to talk about Jainism. Is this a 38-year-old woman? Is that worthwhile? Think about that a little bit more. I'd like to start talking about that on Wednesday. Then you're also going to read two more chapters, chapters 3 and chapters 4. Both present us with some similar questions. Daughters of Yalama is going to eventually take us into sex trafficking, and what has a kind of traditional past in these kind of temple prostitutes, and read someone who is in that life today, read about her life. And then the second one is the Singer of Epics, which I think is a really interesting chapter. Gives you a sense of the Ramayana and how these kind of Hindu epics function in different places in India. What I'd like you to think about and respond to for Wednesday is this question: how is the modern world transforming traditions? Can you take these two stories and say something in common about how modernity is transforming traditions for better or for worse? What is the kind of, is there a similar point that you can make about both of these, about modernity and traditional religions? All right. And that's what we'll talk about. So answer that in the response area for Wednesday, and then that's something that we'll look at when we talk. So make sure you have a handle on these chapters 3 and 4, because I'd like to really be able to kind of dig into them on the main part of our class on Wednesday. Okay, look forward to seeing you in our discussion sections tomorrow.